The Cosmic Memorial Network was older than most stars. It had been built 12 billion years ago by a species called the Architects. No one remembered what the Architects looked like anymore. They had died out long before most current species learned to walk upright, but their creation lived on. The network was simple in purpose but vast in scale. It collected stories of heroes from across the universe. It recorded their deeds in every known language. Then it broadcast those stories to every corner of every galaxy where intelligent life existed. The goal was to make sure that true courage would never be forgotten. 17 galaxies received the broadcasts. Millions of species listened. The stories came through crystalline relay stations that floated in the dark spaces between stars. Each station was the size of a small moon. Each one hummed with the weight of billions of tailies collected over billions of years. The beings who ran the network were called curators. They were not alive in the way most creatures understood life. They had no bodies. They existed as pure thought, as patterns of energy that could observe and record but never truly feel. The Architects had made them this way on purpose. Heroes deserved to be remembered by judges who could not be swayed by emotion. For 12 billion years, the curators had done their work well. They had watched the sacrifice their entire to close a hole in reality that threatened to swallow 100 star systems. They had recorded the final hours of the Engineer of Nine, who had held a dying sun together with nothing but willpower and ancient machines, while 3 billion people fled to safety. They had broadcast the song of the crystalline mothers of Andromeda, who had shattered themselves into dust to seed new life on 1,000 barren worlds. The curators had seen courage. They had seen sacrifice. They had seen beings choose death so that others might live. After 12 billion years, they thought they understood heroism completely. They were wrong. The signal came from an unremarkable galaxy. The humans who lived there had only recently learned to travel between stars. They were young by cosmic standards. Their civilization was barely 10,000 years old. Their bodies were fragile. Their lives were short. The curators had noted their existence but had not expected much from them. The signal was a distress call from a cargo ship named the Persistence. It was a small vessel built for carrying supplies between colony worlds. It had a crew of 47 humans. None of them were soldiers. None of them were trained for combat. They were engineers and pilots and cooks and medical staff, ordinary people doing ordinary work. The Persistence had encountered a shroud. Shrouds were among the most feared things in the universe. They were creatures of living darkness. They fed on heat and light and life itself. Where they passed, stars dimmed. Planets froze. Ships became tombs of ice and silence. No weapon known to any species could harm a shroud. The only defense was to run, and the Persistence could not run. Its engines had been damaged in the initial encounter. The curators watched with clinical interest. This was a common scenario. A ship meets a predator it cannot fight. The crew dies. Perhaps some show courage in their final moments. Perhaps one or two perform acts worthy of recording. The curators had seen this story 10 million times before. They expected the humans to panic. They expected fighting over the escape pods. They expected the strong to save themselves while the weak were left behind. This was the pattern. This was what evolution demanded. Those most likely to survive would prioritize their own lives. It was simple mathematics. Captain gathered her crew in the cargo bay. She was a small woman with gray streaking her dark hair. She had been a cargo captain for 20 years. She had never faced anything like this before. No human had. The curators recorded her words. She told her crew exactly what they faced. She did not soften the truth. She did not offer false hope. A shroud was closing in on their ship. Their engines were dead. The cold was coming. They had perhaps 6 hours before the temperature dropped low enough to kill them all. She also told them there might be a way to save some of them. The ship's engineer, a young man named Thomas Park, had proposed a desperate plan. If they vented their remaining atmosphere into space, the sudden release of heat might create a thermal bloom bright enough to distract the shroud. For a few minutes, maybe less, the creature might turn toward the warmth instead of the ship. Those minutes could be enough for some crew members to reach the emergency pods and launch toward a nearby planet. Not everyone could fit in the pods. Not everyone could make the run in time. Those who stayed behind would freeze when the atmosphere was vented. Asked for volunteers to stay behind. The curators paused their monitoring of 17 other developing situations across the galaxy. This was unexpected. The captain was not ordering anyone to die. She was not selecting victims based on rank or usefulness or age. She was asking who would choose to sacrifice themselves for the others. 23 hands went up immediately. The curators ran calculations. They checked their translation protocols. Surely they had misunderstood something. These 23 humans had just volunteered to die for people who were not their genetic relatives. Many of them did not even know each other well. They were sacrificing themselves for acquaintances, for people they had met only weeks ago. Over the next hour, the rest of the crew also volunteered. Every single one of them. 47 humans, all willing to be the ones who stayed behind. Solution to this problem confused the curators even more than the volunteering itself. She organized a lottery. Each name would be drawn randomly. Those whose names were drawn would go to the escape pods. Those whose names were not drawn would stay behind to operate the airlock and ensure the plan worked. The curators had never seen anything like this. In 12 billion years of recording heroism, they had never encountered a species that chose its survivors by pure chance. Every other species valued some lives over others, the young over the old, the skilled over the unskilled, the leaders over the followers, but these humans refused to rank themselves. Pulled names from a container. When her own name came out as one of the survivors, she put it back and drew again. The curators stopped their broadcasts to 17 galaxies for the first time in 4 billion years. They focused all their attention on this small cargo ship in an unremarkable corner of an unremarkable galaxy. They did not understand what they were seeing. They needed to understand. The lottery finished. 19 humans would go to the escape pods. 28 would stay behind, was among those who stayed. The survivors said goodbye to those who were staying. The curators recorded these farewells. They were strange. There was no anger. There was no resentment. Those who had been chosen to die expressed gratitude. They thanked the others for the chance to make this choice. They said they were honored to give their lives for their. Thomas Park was one of those who would die. He was 26 years old. He had a sister on Earth he would never see again. He hugged each of the survivors and told them to live well. Then he went to the engineering console to monitor the atmospheric venting. Went to the main airlock. Her hand would be the one to pull the release lever. She wanted to be the one responsible. She did not want anyone else to carry that weight. The survivors reached the escape pods. They sealed the doors. They waited. Spoke to her remaining crew through the ship's communication system. She thanked them for their courage. She told them she was proud to die beside them. Then she pulled the lever. The atmosphere screamed out into space. The cold came instantly. The curators watched as 28 humans froze in seconds. They watched the shroud turn toward the thermal bloom, distracted by the burst of heat. They watched the escape pods launch into the darkness. When rescue ships arrived 11 days later, they found 19 survivors on a frozen moon. They also found the Persistence, dark and silent. His body was still at the airlock, her frozen hand still gripping the lever. The curators began their broadcast. They did not yet understand what they had witnessed, but they knew it was important. They knew the universe needed to hear this story. They had no idea it was only the beginning. The broadcast reached every corner of the 17 galaxies within a single day. The curators used their highest priority channel, the one reserved for events of cosmic significance. They had not used this channel in over 1 million years. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had listened to the network for billions of years sent questions. They wanted clarification. They wanted to make sure the translation was correct. Surely the curators had made some error. Surely these humans had not actually done what the broadcast claimed. The who had sacrificed their own world to save others demanded more information. They had given up their planet, yes, but they had done so after careful calculation. They had determined that the loss of one world was acceptable to save 100. Their sacrifice had been logical. It had been strategic. It had been the mathematically correct choice. But these humans had not calculated anything. They had not weighed the value of lives against each other. They had simply refused to let any of their crew die alone. The collective minds of Theta sent 7,000 questions about something called empathy. They had encountered the concept before, but they had always understood it as a survival mechanism. Creatures felt empathy for genetic relatives because protecting relatives meant protecting shared genes. Creatures felt empathy for community members because the community provided safety. Empathy, in the understanding of the collective minds, was always tied to self-interest. The humans on the Persistence had shown empathy for people who shared almost none of their genes. They had shown empathy for they had known for only weeks. They had shown empathy for people who could offer them nothing in return. The collective minds could not understand this. They asked the curators for more examples. The curators had not planned to search human history. Humans were a young species, barely worth noting in the grand timeline of the universe. But the questions kept coming. Species across 17 galaxies wanted to know if the crew of the Persistence was unusual. Were these 47 humans special somehow? Were they the exceptions? Or were they typical of their kind? The curators began to search. What they found kept them broadcasting for 300 years without pause. There was a woman named who had lived on Earth during a time of great evil. Powerful people had decided that certain humans deserved to die simply because of how they were born. They built walls around these humans and planned to kill them all. Had worked as a nurse. She had used her position to smuggle children out of the walled area. She had hidden them with families who would raise them as their own. She had saved over 2,000 children. She knew that if she was caught, she would be tortured and killed. She was caught. She was tortured. She did not give up a single name. She survived and continued her work. The curators broadcast her story. The questions increased. There was a man named James Harrison who had lived on an island continent on Earth. When he was 14 years old, he needed surgery. He received blood from strangers to save his life. He decided to repay this gift by donating his own blood. His blood turned out to contain rare antibodies that could save the lives of Bobbies with a certain medical condition. He donated blood every few weeks for 60 years. His donations saved over 2 million lives. He never met most of the people he saved. He never expected thanks or reward. He simply knew that his blood could help, so he gave it. The curators broadcast his story. The collective mind sent 8,000 more questions. There were firefighters who ran into burning buildings to save strangers. There were teachers who shielded students with their own bodies when violence came to their schools. There were soldiers who threw themselves onto explosives to protect their comrades. There were ordinary humans who jumped into frozen rivers to rescue people they had never met. Again and again, the curators found the same pattern. Humans chose to help others even when it cost them everything. They did not calculate. They did not weigh costs against benefits. They saw someone in danger and they acted. A species of energy beings called the had transcended physical form 3 million years ago. They had not felt curiosity about anything in 2 million years. They watched the broadcasts about humans and felt something new stirring in their ancient consciousness. They sent a question to the curators. There was a human named Rick. He had worked in a tall building on Earth. When disaster struck and the building began to collapse, he led people down the stairs to safety. He did this while singing songs. They wanted to know why. What tactical function did singing serve in human heroism? Why would a human spend his final minutes making music? The curators did not know the answer. They were not sure any answer would make sense to beings who had never felt what humans felt. But they kept broadcasting, and the universe kept listening. The youngest species in the 17 galaxies had captured the attention of the oldest. Beings who had lived for billions of years found themselves fascinated by creatures who rarely survived a single century. The mystery of human heroism had become the most discussed topic in the cosmic memorial network's entire history. And the humans themselves had no idea. They went on living their brief lives, unaware that every act of courage, every moment of sacrifice, every choice to help a stranger was being recorded and broadcast across the stars. The curators realized they would need to pay much closer attention to this species. They had been watching the universe for 12 billion years. They had thought they understood heroism, but humans were teaching them that they had barely begun to understand it at all. The changes came slowly at first. They came so slowly that even the curators, who measured time in billions of years, almost did not notice them. It started with questions. Species across the 17 galaxies kept asking about humans. They wanted more stories. They wanted to understand how such a young and fragile species could produce so many heroes. The curators searched human history and found more examples than they could ever broadcast. Every human culture, every human era, every corner of their small blue world had produced people who chose others over themselves. They were the first to take action. They were an ancient species, proud of their own sacrifice. They had given up there to save others, but they had done it once in one great moment of calculated courage. Humans did it constantly, in small ways and large, without any calculation at all. They sent ambassadors to human space. They wanted to study this species. They wanted to understand the source of human heroism. What they found surprised them. Humans did not consider themselves heroes. The survivors of the Persistence spoke of their dead with sadness and gratitude, but they did not understand why the galaxy was so interested. Of course, the crew had volunteered to sacrifice themselves. Of course, had given up her spot in the lottery. Of course, they had refused to rank human lives against each other. What else would they have done? The ambassadors reported back to their people. Humans did not think they were special. They did not think their heroism was unusual. They assumed that anyone would do the same thing in the same situation. This confused them. They knew that not everyone would do the same thing. They had studied thousands of species. Most species, when faced with death, fought to save themselves. Most species valued their own lives above the lives of strangers. Humans were the exception, and they did not even realize it. The Cosmic Memorial Network created a new channel. It broadcast only human stories. The channel ran continuously, never pausing, never repeating. There were always new stories to tell. A woman in a coastal city who had run back into a flooded building to rescue elderly neighbors she barely knew. A teenager who had stepped in front of a weapon to protect a child. A doctor who had refused to leave a plague zone even as the disease spread, and her own colleagues died around her. A man who had spent his entire life savings to buy and free people who had been enslaved. The stories were not all about death. Many human heroes survived, but survival was never the point. The point was the choice. The moment when a human saw someone in need and decided to help, regardless of the cost to themselves. The curators developed a new classification system. They had categories for every type of heroism they had encountered in 12 billion years. But human heroism did not fit the existing categories. Humans sacrificed themselves for genetic relatives, like other species. But they also sacrificed themselves for strangers. They sacrificed themselves for members of other species. They sacrificed themselves for ideas, for principles, for people who would never know their names. The curators created a new category, heroism without calculation. The term spread through the 17 galaxies. Species who had never thought about heroism began to discuss it. What would it mean to act without calculating the cost? What would it mean to help someone simply because they needed help, without asking what you would get in return? For most species, the idea was terrifying. It went against every survival instinct they had evolved over millions of years. But for some, it was something else. It was inspiring. 5 centuries after the persistence, the Cosmic Memorial Network had been transformed. The curators no longer simply recorded and broadcast. They had become teachers. Species across the galaxy came to them with questions about human heroism. They wanted to learn. They wanted to understand. Some of them wanted to try. The first non-human to attempt heroism without calculation was an engineer named. His ship had encountered a distress signal from a vessel belonging to a species that had fought wars against for. Every instinct, every calculation, every ounce of common sense told to ignore the signal. His people had no obligation to help their ancient enemies. Changed course and went to help anyway. He told the curators later that he had thought about the humans on the persistence. They had not asked whether they deserved to be saved. They had not weighed old grudges or calculated future benefits. They had simply seen people in danger and chosen to help. Wanted to be that kind of hero. He saved the crew of the enemy ship. It caused a scandal in space. It also caused something else. It caused conversations. Others began to wonder if perhaps their ancient enemies were not so different from themselves, if perhaps the old hatreds were not as important as they had always believed. The curators broadcast story alongside the human stories. They noted something remarkable. A young species from an unremarkable galaxy was teaching the oldest civilizations in the universe how to be better. Humans, meanwhile, had finally learned that the galaxy was watching. Young humans grew up knowing that the Cosmic Memorial Network existed. They knew that their ancestors' courage had been deemed worthy of eternal broadcast. They knew that somewhere in the universe, right now, beings they would never meet were learning about human heroes. The curators worried about this. They feared that humans might change their behavior now that they knew they had an audience. They feared that humans might perform heroism for the attention, for the glory, for the chance to be remembered across 17 galaxies. Their fears were unfounded. Humans continued to act exactly as they always had. They helped strangers. They sacrificed themselves for others. They chose death over abandoning those who needed them. The only difference was that now, sometimes, they looked up at the stars and wondered who was listening. The last story the curators added to their priority broadcast was not about a soldier or a captain or a leader. It was not about someone who saved millions of lives. It was about a 14-year-old girl named. Lived on a colony world in the Andromeda Galaxy. It was a cold planet with long winters and frozen lakes. One winter day, she saw a dog fall through the ice of a pond near her home. The dog belonged to no one. It was a stray that wandered the colony, eating scraps and sleeping in doorways. Did not even know its name. She knew the ice was too thin to hold her weight. She knew the water was cold enough to kill her in minutes. She went onto the ice anyway. Witnesses said she almost made it. She reached the dog. She grabbed its collar. She started pulling it toward the shore. Then the ice broke beneath her. She could have let go of the dog. She could have swum for the edge of the hole in the ice and pulled herself out. She was a strong swimmer. She might have survived. She did not let go. Rescue workers found her body still holding the dog's collar. The dog had died too. They were found together, frozen in the water. The curators broadcast her story to every known galaxy simultaneously. They used the highest priority channel, the one reserved for events of cosmic significance. It was the same channel they had used for the persistence, 300 years before. Species across the universe received the broadcast. Many of them had questions. Why would a human child die for an animal she did not even know? What possible purpose could such a sacrifice serve? The dog had died anyway. Death had saved no one. By any rational measure, her sacrifice had been pointless. The curators answered these questions with a single phrase, a phrase they had never used in 12 billion years of operation. The phrase was, "That is not the point." Humans did not sacrifice themselves because it was logical. They did not weigh costs against benefits. They did not calculate the probability of success before deciding to help. They acted because they could not watch suffering and do nothing. They acted because something in them refused to let another creature face death alone, even if that creature was a stray dog with no name. The curators added a notation to their records about humanity. It was a notation that had never appeared in 12 billion years of recording heroism. It read, "Species demonstrates heroism without calculation. Recommend continued observation. Recommend respect. Recommend hope." The broadcasts continued. The universe kept listening, and slowly across 17 galaxies, other species began to change. They stopped fighting their ancient enemies. The collective minds of Theta began sending aid to species they had never contacted before. The who had not felt curiosity in 2 million years started asking questions about what it meant to care about others. The changes were small at first. They were imperfect. Species that had evolved over billions of years could not transform overnight, but the changes were real. The universe was learning from humanity's example. And somewhere in the cosmic memorial network's endless archives, the story of a 14-year-old girl and a nameless dog would play forever. It would remind the universe what heroism truly meant. Not calculation, not strategy, not even success. Just the simple, impossible, wonderful human refusal to let others suffer alone.